like bolts up, and he goes, "We've never lied to the FBI. We may not have told them everything, but we never lied." And I looked at him and I was like, what the fuck is he doing? Like, who are you saying? Like, first of all, who are you telling that to? Like, I know that's not true. Why would you say what are you doing? Like, you're not telling me. You, me, and Gretchen know that's a lie. So I realized, oh God, he's wired. Hey, this is Matt Cox, and I wanted to go ahead and, if you're watching this, I'm basically going over my story kind of in multiple sections. I've gone over it several times on some podcast platforms and whatever channels like Concrete, Valuetainment, Vlad TV, Soft White Underbelly, a bunch of different ones, but I've never really gone over it in depth on my channel, and that's what I'm basically going to be doing in a series of videos. So the last video I had gone over basically how I got into the business, right? And how I started committing fraud. And for those of you that don't know, I was on the run for 3 years. I've been involved in like about roughly 45 to $55 million in fraud. I was found guilty of committing $15 million in fraud. I went to federal prison for 12 and a half years. So this is the continuation of the first video. If you haven't seen the first video, watch it. All right, so this would be video 2. Let's see. So by the time, so I was committing fraud. I owned my own mortgage company at this point. I had about a dozen brokers. By this point, I would say this is 2000 and, well, I would say I was 30. What was this? 2001? I was 31 years old, something like that, 30, 31. And, committing fraud on a regular basis and making good money. And I was also flipping properties at this point. At this point, I started buying properties real cheap in an area of Tampa, an area of Tampa called Ybor City. And I was buying properties for $40,000, $50,000, putting whatever, $20,000 in them and then selling them for $100,000. Make a profit of like $20,000, $30,000, depending on the house. Well, I was also buying properties and renovating them. So I would buy them, renovate them, and some of them I would sell. Some I would sell, some I would keep. I was also buying rental properties and I would renovate those. By this point, I was married to a girl named Kayla, and I'd had a son named Cass, and what I'd done was we bought about 55 rental units over the course of a year. And what Kayla did was she managed those properties. That was her job. She raised our son and she managed the properties. She was a stay-at-home mom or property manager. But you have to understand she didn't have a job. So one of the things I would do is, obviously she would buy a property. We'd renovate it. She'd rent out the units. And another one of the things I would do sometimes I would go in and I would buy a property in my name. And I would renovate the property, get an appraisal, and then sell the property to Kayla. Well, Kayla never took my last name, so it wasn't Kayla Cox. It was her maiden name. And so I could sell properties to her because the lender didn't know we were married. Because that's not, if you sell, a husband and wife can't sell properties between one another. It's not an arm's length transaction. So that's an issue for lenders. The other thing is, the reason I would buy the properties and sell them to her instead of just buying them and refinancing them was something called seasoning. Seasoning says that, like, you can buy a property for $50,000, let's say. Then you go and you put $40,000 in it. And now the property is worth $150,000. Well, you can't use the value of that property to refinance it. You can only use the sale price of that property for the first year. So after a year, you can say, hey, I bought it for $50, renovated it, and after a year, you can get an appraisal for $150 and refinance based on the value of the appraisal. But for the first year, you have to go based on the cost of the purchase of the property and the renovations. So instead of getting an appraisal for $150,000, I can only go off of the $50,000 I bought it for plus the $30,000. That's not enough to refinance it get my money back and pull out any money if I wanted to pull out money. So what I did to get around that was I bought the properties in my name, renovated the properties, sold them to Kayla because Kayla isn't subject to seasoning because she's a new buyer. So I would do that. And then, of course, all of her documents were fraudulent. So her W-2s and pay stubs were all fraudulent. Everything about the file was fraudulent. She was real. She had perfect credit. But the entire kind of transaction was fraudulent. Well, I'm running my mortgage company, and not all of the loans going through were fraud. I mean, we were an FHA-approved lender, a VA-approved lender. We did conventional, and we did subprime loans. But most of the subprime loans, almost all the subprime loans were fraud. And some of the FHA and some of the conventional. So I would say 60 to 80% of the loans going through that company were fraudulent. Well, one of the things that happened was I had bought some properties and I had sold them to Kayla. I think it was 3 properties. And at some point, a couple of the brokers that used to work for me, one being my ex, my old manager. Remember the manager that I'd first committed fraud, showed me how to commit fraud? She had come to work for me, and then she opened up her own mortgage company. Her name was Gretchen, and her husband was Pete. So it was Peter. So it was Gretchen and Pete Zayas. So they had come to work for me, and then they went and started their own company. Well, what I was doing was, because I was buying these properties and renovating them, I didn't want to close the loans through my own company because, once again, that's also not a non-arm's length transaction. So I could buy the properties, I could sell them to my wife at the time in her maiden name, but I couldn't close those loans in my company's name. So I had those loans and I ran those closings through Gretchen Zaya's company. Well, at some point, I'd done like 3 loans through Gretchen, her company. At some point, Gretchen and Pete got in trouble because they were doing what's called a straw man scam. They'd met a bunch of guys that were buying houses and selling them to each other. So they'd find a house for, let's say, $500,000, and then they'd get it appraised at like $700,000, which in that range isn't that difficult to do. So the new buyer would qualify for so one guy has it for $500,000, he buys it. He sells it for $700,000 to some borrower. That borrower qualifies for $700,000 because Gretchen is committing fraud. She's creating a fraudulent W-2s, pay stubs, whatever she's doing. She's getting this guy to qualify for a $700,000 loan that he's not really shouldn't qualify for. So when the guy who bought it for $500,000 sells it to the guy who's qualifying for a $700,000 loan, now there's a profit of $700,000. Well, Gretchen was getting a huge broker fee plus a kickback, and these guys are splitting whatever. Let's say there's $150,000 left over. They're splitting $150,000. They rent the property out, and they're supposed to rent it out and have someone rent it. Well, what ended up happening was the one guy borrowed. He qualified for 5 or 6 loans. She did 5 or 6 loans for this one guy. He never makes a payment. Those loans go into foreclosure. They're what's called first payment defaults, and as a result of that first payment default, the FBI comes in and they investigate. They realize it's a fraud. They're all fraudulent transactions, and they realize that Pete and Gretchen Zayas are the ones who did the fraudulent transactions. They come into their office and they raid their office. They get all their files, including my ex-wife's file. That's what they told me anyway. The truth is, so I could call up, or Gretchen, and I get a phone call from Gretchen one day. I know she's in trouble. I had just refinanced her personal residence to get her the money to pay her lawyer. And as soon as I got her that money, she gave it to her lawyer. The first thing her lawyer said was, "Who did this loan?" And she said, "Well, this guy, Matt Cox. Is he committing fraud?" She said, "Yes." He said, "My advice to you is to wear a wire on him, get him to talk about fraud, get him busted, and then you don't have to go to jail. So rat him out. So the guy that just refinanced your house to get you the money to pay me, I'm telling you to now turn him into the FBI." Nice, right? Like that's a good criminal lawyer. Hey, sorry for interrupting the video, but I want to let you guys know that if you join my Patreon at the top tier, every single month you get a different painting, and the contact information for my Patreon page is in the description. Back to the video. And so what she does is she wears a wire. She calls me up and says, look, can I talk to you? Can we have lunch? I want to talk to you about about something. So I go, sure, no problem. So I drive out to this pizzeria and I meet her and Pete and I sit down and I go, hey, what's up? And she says, listen, the FBI is asking about you. And I go, about me? She goes, yeah, well, not so much about you. She said about Kayla, my wife. And I went, why? What about Kayla? She goes, well, you know those 3 loans that you did through my company? And I went, yeah. She said, they're asking about those loans. They're saying that they know that you and Kayla are married and or they think that you're married or whatever it was. They know the loans are fraudulent. And I went, are you serious? I said, what did you tell them? She said, well, we haven't told them anything. I said, you didn't tell them that the W-2s and pay stubs are fake, did you? You haven't told them anything about the loan. Like, I immediately start saying things that bury me. You didn't tell them we were married, did you? You didn't tell them, I'm just burying myself. And I remember in the middle of the conversation, I remember saying, look, here's what you do. Tell them you never met Kayla. Say she called you on the phone. She gave you the information on the phone. She faxed over all the information. So I start coming up with this plausible way for them to deny that they really knew anything about the fraud. And then I would have Kayla just not talk to the FBI. And therefore, the whole investigation should fall apart. You don't have anybody cooperating. Nobody met in person. Who knows who showed up at the closing? We don't really know. Basically, they could blame it. Kayla could blame it on Gretchen and Pete. Pete and Gretchen could blame it on Kayla. Who knows what the processors and underwriters did? There's too many people involved to indict someone. So that was my thought process. I was wrong, but that was my thought process. So I started coming up with this plausible story to try and clear everybody, or at least put enough confusion into the whole investigation that they don't pursue it. And while I'm explaining this, I remember Gretchen said, Matt, we can't lie to the FBI. And I went, what? What are you talking about? I go, you've been lying to them. I said, you just lied to them when you just went and refinanced your house because their house loan was all fraudulent. W-2s were fraudulent, the pay stubs, everything. I go, you just lied to them. You just borrowed $70,000 to pay your lawyer. That whole loan was fraud. You've been lying. And so Pete stands up, bolts up, and he goes, we've never lied to the FBI. We may not have told them everything, but we never lied. And I looked at him and I was like, what the fuck is he doing? Who are you telling that to? I know that's not true. Why would you say what are you doing? You're not telling me. You, me, and Gretchen know that's a lie. So I realized, oh God, he's wired. And I was like, oh my God. What's so funny about that is that the FBI agent was actually sitting right beside us, kind of behind, and I had, at one point when we first sat down, I go, hey, I go, bro, because the guy that was sitting there, the FBI agent, had ordered a slice of pizza, and he had folded the pizza up, and the napkin was under the pizza, was wrapped around the pizza, and he was eating the pizza and the napkin. And so I go, hey, bro, and he looked, and he kind of tried not to look over, he was looking like that. I go, whoa, hey. So finally he glances at me, I go, bro, you're eating your napkin. And he goes, what? And he looked and he goes, oh, thanks. And he kind of they all glanced at each other. And I didn't smile like a nervous smile. I didn't realize that was the FBI agent. He's sitting there and they're recording it. So anyway, Pete stands up and goes, we haven't lied. We haven't told them everything, but we never lied. And I was like, oh man. And I looked down, I realized both their cell phones are on the table. They're both sitting there leaning in. And I was like, oh, they're wired. And I looked and I said, wow. I said, I hope you get something for me. I hope you get something for this. And she looked at me and she starts crying. Tears start rolling down her face. And she said, I don't have to go to jail, Matt. She goes, I have a kid. And I go, I don't have a kid? She babysat my kid. We've been on vacation together. I go, I don't have a kid? I said, listen. I said, tell the FBI agent I'll talk to him, but not to come in my office, because when the FBI raided her office, everybody quit. I go, so, because they're all committing fraud. So I said, you tell him not to come in my office. Call me on the phone and I'll come down there and talk to him. So I stand up and I leave. Hey, I hope you're enjoying the video. And if you're interested in buying a painting from me, my contact information is in the description box. Back to the video. But look, I drove back to my office. Within 10 or 15 minutes, my secretary goes, Matt, there's an agent, Scott Gale, on the phone for you, FBI. And I was like, holy shit. Pick up the phone. I'm like, hey, what's going on? He goes, hey, Mr. Cox, I'm sure you know what this is about. He didn't even pretend he didn't even come up with a story. He knew. It was like, he didn't even pretend oh, I just happened to be investigating. No, I called because they told me to call. He goes, look, I know you know what this is about. Why don't you, when can you come down? I said, oh, I'll come down on Monday. Yeah, I'll call you. Give me your phone number, and I guess phone number, everything. Well, I immediately go out and I schedule a bunch of appointments with lawyers. I end up with a lawyer by the name of Gary Trombley, super high-profile lawyer. I give him $75,000, and to basically, I go in and I explain to him. I said, listen, man. I said, he was like, well, based on potential loss, you could be looking at 3 years. And I go, potential loss? He's like, yeah, you could have lost. And he starts adding up the numbers, and it doesn't even make sense. It's all bullshit. He's trying to scare me. And he did scare me. But what he was saying was, look, these properties are worth, let's say $150,000. So that's a potential loss of $150,000. And he said, because, if they went bad, then they'll end up losing $150,000. I said, no. I said, that loss is offset by the property itself. And the property is worth $150,000. She borrowed $150. It's worth $150. We have appraisals on it. And he's like, that's not how it works. And I had read the example of potential loss, and I said, that's exactly how it works. And I read off the example. And he's like, Matt, listen, Mr. Cox, that's just not how it works. Okay, trust me. There's a $500,000 potential loss. You could do up to 3 years. Blah blah blah. He was full of shit. He's just trying to justify his fee, because what happened was a few months later when I come back, he says, well, I got them to drop the potential loss by offsetting the potential loss with the value of the home. And see, the way it works is, then he explained the same thing that I had told him I had read. It was like, bro, what are you doing? This is exactly what the conversation we had before. Only now he's making my argument. The point is, I pay him $75,000. I plead guilty. I end up pleading guilty to, I think it was wire fraud. So I pled guilty to wire fraud. Now, they wanted to charge my ex-wife, or my wife at the time, Kayla, and I told them that the conversation was, the initial conversation was, he said, you should cooperate. He said, you should go in your office. He goes, is there anybody else committing fraud? I said, they're all committing fraud. And he goes, you should go in the office, grab 10 or 20 of the most egregious fraudulent files from your brokers, bring them to the FBI, work with the FBI to get those brokers busted, charged and indicted. And then he said, I might be able to get your charges dropped, you and your wife's charges dropped completely. It's called pretrial intervention. So if you work with them, they won't indict you, because I hadn't been indicted yet, nor had my wife at the time. And I said, nah, bro. I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to indict. I'm not going to get these guys messed up. I'm not going to get these people. I'm not going to rat out my friends. I totally still believe that there was a code. Everybody, we were all kind of like criminals, and we were going to look out for each other. And I didn't realize how it worked, that really everybody rolls over on everybody. I believed, the Godfather in Omerta, and you don't tell on your friends, and you don't tell on the other criminals, and it just doesn't exist. So, but at the time I was an idiot, and had it been now and what I know now, I would have walked in there with a dolly. I would have walked into our Friday meeting with a dolly and asked the guys to help me load up all of the file cabinets, walk back into the meeting and say, listen, I'm going to bring these to the FBI, and I just suggest you guys all get lawyers and cooperate, because you're all going to be fucked up. And I would have left. But I was an idiot, and I didn't do that, and I let myself get indicted, and I actually said, look, I will plead guilty indict me, plead guilty if you drop the charges on my wife. She didn't know anything was going on. She didn't know. So the lawyer goes back to the U.S. attorney and explains that situation. He says, we believe that the wife knew everything. There's no way she didn't know this. But we think Cox was orchestrated the whole thing, and we get him wanting to plead guilty to take the charge for his wife. There's no reason for them both to get in trouble. So we have no problem with that. And they said, of course, they did say there could be no indictments if I would cooperate. And of course, he said, well, he's unwilling to cooperate. He says that, he's not going to do that. They said, okay, fine. Well, because there was no potential loss and no actual loss, I ended up getting 3 years. I pled guilty to wire fraud and got 3 years probation. I had to forfeit my license as a mortgage broker. Well, I was also a brokerage business owner. So that meant that I could no longer run my brokerage business. It couldn't be in my name. So I transferred the brokerage business into one of my brokers. He was a CPA. He had, that's not true. He was a tax attorney. He had a master's degree in tax. He wasn't a CPA. He had a master's degree in tax, and so he was an accountant. Anyway, so I transferred the company into his name, and he kept me on. He paid me $8,000 a month because that's what my basic bills were. And at the same time that all of that happened, so when all of that happened, all this is happening, my wife and I get a divorce. So we're in the middle of this whole thing. We start the divorce proceedings. And by the time I'm now a felon, I've lost my business, although I still do have an income coming in. She got all the properties. I paid off all of her credit cards, all of her debts, everything she had. I paid her off. I paid $2,000 a month for child support, and she kept all of the properties and collected rent on those properties. So she was making over $100 and something odd $1,000. Plus, you get that she got all the depreciation of the properties. So you've got a couple $1 million worth of properties that she's getting the depreciation on. So she's paying almost no taxes, and she's got a huge amount of money coming in. And I'm living off of $8,000 a month, and my bills are outrageous. Anyway, I end up moving into this property in Ybor City. I had completely renovated. Property I'd bought for like $80,000. And, but I know it sounds like $8,000 is a lot of money. All right. But the life I was living at that time, I'm driving a brand new Audi. I think it was an Audi Quattro TT. Those were like 50, 60 grand. And it was a lease. It was like $1,000 a month up for the lease. I've got my property I'm renovating a new property. I'm buying rental properties. I'm flipping properties. I mean, I was doing okay, I guess, but I wasn't making the kind of money I'd made when I owned the mortgage company, and everything I'd basically made at the mortgage company, I just handed over to my ex-wife. I was able to see my son every other weekend. I got him like every Wednesday, and that was nice. I had a girlfriend I was dating. I was dating a bunch of different chicks. And that's really where this really went off the rails. Because now I at this point, I don't own the mortgage company anymore. I'm getting a salary from the mortgage company, and I'm able to help manage it by dealing with a lot of the paperwork and helping to train the brokers. But I now don't really have a full-time job. I mean, that's maybe 20 hours a week. And so what I decided was I'm going to open a development company with this guy named Rudy. He's a real estate agent. He's actually still a real estate agent here in Tampa. He didn't talk to me for some reason. I don't know. He's kind of a dickhead. So, especially for a guy who was committing just a ton of fraud. Now he doesn't want to talk to me because he's like, that was a horrible part of my turn. That was a horrible. It's funny. He says that was a horrible thing that happened, that whole fraud thing, and then I got talked to by the FBI, and it was just a horrible part of my life. It's like, I'm the one that went to prison. Like, you didn't get indicted. You're still a real estate agent. You didn't go to jail for 12 and a half years. Like, nothing happened to you. You talked to the FBI and you were scared. So, what a fucking jerk off that guy is. So what ended up happening was I met Rudy, and Rudy and I and my other partner, his name was David, and another guy named Jonathan, we all decided to open up a development company and start building brand new like luxury lofts, which are like really nice duplexes in Ybor City, a shithole area of Tampa. But it was going through a lot of gentrification. There was a lot of money being dumped into the area. And so we decided to do that. But, we don't really have the money to do it. So I figured, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start flipping properties and committing fraud to raise the money to do this development company. And in my mind, I was thinking I'll steal the money and invest it in a legitimate company. And that's just a really foolish way to think. But at the time, because now all the money going into that company is tainted, and as a result of that, that company is completely fraudulent and therefore able to be seized by the government if they could ever link that money to the fraudulent transactions. So what I came up with, I sat back and I thought, you know what I'm going to do? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come up with a fraud that I can commit that's a massive, massive fraud that I can commit that nobody actually knows a fraud has been committed. And that fraud included what's called synthetic identity fraud. And it was bank fraud and mortgage fraud and real estate fraud and credit card fraud all wrapped into one. And really just a really amazing scheme that I came up with. And I hate to say that, and I know it sounds like I'm bragging and everything else, but listen, I've got professional FBI, Secret Service, professional white-collar criminals, white-collar experts. I got judges, lawyers, everybody. All of them are saying the same thing. It was a brilliant scam. And so when you watch the next video, I'll go over exactly how that scam worked and what the scam was and how I got caught several times and got out of it and the whole rigmarole. And I will go over that next video. And so if you like this video, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button. Hit the bell so you get notified every time I release a video on this series. Also, leave a comment in the comment section. Let me know if you like these types of videos and if you want me to keep doing them. And I appreciate it. And check out the next video, and I will see you.